Let's dive right into this explainer and unpack what has to be the ultimate historical paradox. I mean, we're looking at the guy who basically kicked off the widespread European colonization of the Americas, completely changing the course of human history. Yet, get this, he died stubbornly believing he was actually in Asia. Christopher Columbus is a figure totally wrapped up in legend, intense controversy, and honestly, a surprising amount of just really bad math. So let's get right into it.
So to start us off, we really need to tackle the absolute biggest myth surrounding his famous pitch to the Spanish crown. If you learned about Columbus in elementary school, you were probably told he was this lone, brilliant visionary fighting against a whole world of people who thought he was literally going to sail right off the edge of the map. While the stark contrast between that myth and reality is fascinating. The spherical shape of the Earth, that had actually been common knowledge since antiquity. Scholars way back in the 3rd century BC, like Eratosthenes, had already correctly figured out the Earth's circumference. Columbus's real struggle with the learned men of Spain and Portugal wasn't about the shape of the globe at all. It was simply bad math. They knew his distance calculations were completely, wildly wrong.
Section 1. The Great Miscalculation.
Based on a whole mishmash of flawed geographical texts, Columbus calculated this incredibly low estimate, just 2,400 nautical miles. That was his projected distance sailing west from the Canary Islands over to Japan. Now, how did he get this so wrong? Well, he read estimates by an astronomer named Alfraganus, but he completely missed the fact that those estimates were expressed in Arabic miles, rather than the much shorter Roman miles he was used to. Add to that his heavy reliance on Marco Polo's extremely exaggerated claims about how far Asia stretched to the east, and you've got a recipe for disaster.
Because wow, 10,600 nautical miles is the actual distance from the Canaries to Japan. It's massive. The Portuguese king's advisors rejected his pitch precisely because they did the math. Literally no ship in the 15th century could carry enough food and water for a 10,000-mile voyage. So the absolute kicker here is that his crew definitely would have starved to death in the middle of the ocean if the giant, totally unexpected landmass of the Americas hadn't been sitting right in the way.
And his, let's say, bizarre geographical theories didn't just end with that first voyage. Take a look at this quote from 1498. Based on some pretty flawed observations of the North Star, Columbus seriously theorized that the Earth wasn't a perfect sphere at all. Nope. He thought it was shaped like a pear, or even a woman's breast, with the highest stalk pointing right up toward the earthly paradise. He was fiercely independent in his reading, sure, but often spectacularly wrong in his conclusions.
Section 2. 4 Voyages West.
Despite his flawed mouth, a recently unified Spain decided to take a massive gamble on Columbus. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella had just wrapped up the Reconquista, a super long war in the Iberian Peninsula, and they desperately needed a competitive edge in the highly lucrative spice trade. As we map out his 4 distinct expeditions across the Atlantic, it's clear this wasn't just a one-and-done trip in 1492. Over a 12-year period, Columbus kept going back. His second voyage alone brought 17 ships and 1,500 men to set up permanent colonies. By his third and fourth voyages, he was actively mapping the coastlines of South and Central America, effectively tearing the door open for European influence in the Americas.
Let's zero in on the specifics of that fateful first trip. He set off with 3 ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Now, what Columbus did brilliantly here was use the Atlantic trade winds, a technique the Portuguese actually called the turn of the sea. He sailed south down to the Canaries first to catch the winds blowing west, which was absolutely vital to his success. But when he made landfall on October 12th in the Bahamas, encountering the indigenous Lucayan, Taino, and Arawak peoples, he completely misidentified where he was. He literally called the inhabitants Indios because he genuinely thought he was in the East Indies.
This single term, the Columbian Exchange, basically defines the monumental, world-altering ripple effect triggered by his arrival. We aren't just talking about a meeting of people. It was an unprecedented biological and cultural collision. Crops, livestock, ideas, and, tragically, diseases began flowing across the Atlantic, permanently linking 2 hemispheres that had been totally separated for millennia. It was a real game changer.
Section 3. Conquest and Brutality.
Now, as we dive into the objective historical record of his time actually governing these newly established colonies, we can see directly from his own journal, written on the very day he arrived, exactly how he viewed the indigenous populations right out of the gate. He notes their intelligence, sure, but he frames it by stating they should be good and intelligent servants. From day one, the entire perspective was strictly about subjugation, extracting resources, and religious conversion. To manage all these new territories, Columbus implemented something called the encomienda system.
This quickly became the brutal economic engine of the new colonies, especially in Hispaniola. Basically, it rewarded Spanish conquerors with the forced, unpaid labor of the native peoples, forcing them to work the fields and the newly established gold and silver mines. The historical sources impartially document that a combination of these horrific factors led to a catastrophic collapse of the indigenous population. You see, the native peoples had absolutely no acquired immunity to old world diseases like smallpox. You combine that devastating biological impact with the extreme physical toll of forced labor in the mines, the incredibly violent military suppression of any rebellions, and the start of a transatlantic slave trade sending natives back to Spain. The demographic impact was just staggering. Some historians note that within just a few decades, populations that might have numbered in the hundreds of thousands or more were reduced to mere hundreds.
And the historical record shows exactly how his own contemporaries viewed the style of governance. By the year 1500, reports of his tyranny had reached the Spanish court, so they sent a royal commissioner, Francisco de Bobadilla, to go investigate. Bobadilla's official report found that Columbus regularly used torture and mutilation to govern both natives and Spanish colonists alike. Those precise actions led Bobadilla to actually arrest Columbus, put him in chains, and ship him all the way back to Spain, effectively stripping him of his governorship for good.
Section 4. An evolving legacy.
So how exactly does a disgraced former governor transform into a global icon, and then later a subject of such intense modern scrutiny? It's an incredible irony that the man who completely reshaped the globe died in 1506, likely suffering from a severe form of reactive arthritis, still totally confused about where he actually went. In his final years, he spent his time fighting a really lengthy series of lawsuits against the Spanish crown, demanding the massive profits he felt he was owed from the trade in the lands he found. And yes, he was still referring to them as outposts of Asia. When we talk about his legacy of discovery, the historical reality is, well, super nuanced. While Columbus is credited in popular culture with discovering America, Norse explorers like Leif Erikson had actually established a settlement in North America around the year 1000. That's half a millennium earlier. But what sets Columbus apart in the historical record isn't being the first. It's the fact that his voyages initiated permanent, unbroken contact and sparked the massive Columbian exchange that followed.
Over the centuries, his legacy has radically shifted. After the American Revolution in the 1700s, the newly formed U.S. actually used Columbus as a founding myth, literally naming the national personification Columbia to distance themselves from Britain. Fast forward to the 1892 Chicago World's Fair, and he was being celebrated as the ultimate American hero. But jump to the 1990s and beyond, and a narrative heavily focusing on the genocide and exploitation of indigenous peoples really began to challenge that heroic status. And that leads us right up to the 2020s, where we've seen his monuments removed across the nation.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final thought to consider about how we craft our historical narratives. His math was wrong, his geography was incredibly confused, and the human cost of his arrival was utterly devastating. Yet the impact of his voyages undeniably created the interconnected modern world we live in today. When we look back at figures like Columbus, we really have to ask ourselves, are we studying the man, the myth, or just the mirror that history holds up to our own ever-changing values? Thanks for exploring the source material with me today, and I highly encourage you to keep questioning the stories we're told.